Hello, welcome to the class. So today we're going to discuss Sandra Gilman's article about anti-Semitism. And I think it's an interesting time to discuss this article because of all of the media coverage of protests on university campuses regarding Palestine and Israel. And so, to be fair, I think that it's important to discuss anti-Semitism, and we'll also discuss Islamophobia. We'll talk about the relationship between religious violence, the racialization of religion, and the construction of stateless people. And so, in the last lecture, I talked about Hannah Arendt and Arendt's essay, We Refugees. And then I also discussed Giorgio Agamben's essay, also titled We Refugees, which was part of a symposium regarding Arendt's work. And so in this lecture, I will discuss the relationship between anti-Semitism, ethnic cleansing, war, and the construction of the stateless person. I hope that you are doing well and enjoying the class. The presentation assignments are due today, which is May 30th, 2024, and they're due online. So if you have any questions, please contact me. The final assignment is due in June, and you can upload the final assignment online as well. The lecture will still be obviously synchronous as well on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but you can watch the recorded lecture as well. I hope that you are all doing well and enjoying yourselves wherever you are. Okay, so I'll share my screen. The Holocaust was the genocide of European Jews during World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically murdered some 6 million Jews across across German-occupied Europe, around two-thirds of Europe's Jewish population. The murders were carried out primarily through mass shootings and poison gas in extermination camps, chiefly Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and Chelmno in occupied Poland. Separate Nazi persecutions killed a similar or larger number of non-Jewish civilians and POWs. The term Holocaust is sometimes used to refer to the persecution of these other groups. So the Nazis developed an ideology which I've discussed previously, and Achille Mbembe, who is an academic based in Johannesburg, discusses the relationship between Nazi ideology and colonialism when discussing eugenics. And so many critical race scholars and scholars who are interested in stateless people have drawn on historical writings and an analysis of Nazi ideology to understand ethnic cleansing. The Nazis developed their ideology based on racism and pursuit of living space and seized power in early 1933. Meant to force all German Jews, regardless of means, to attempt to emigrate, the regime passed anti-Jewish laws, encouraged harassment, and orchestrated a nationwide program in November 1938. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, occupation authorities began to establish ghettos and to segregate Jewish people. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, 1.5 to 2 million Jews were shot by German forces and local collaborators. Later, in 1941 or early 1942, the highest levels of the German government decided to murder all Jews in Europe. Victims were deported by rail to extermination camps where, if they survived the journey, most were killed by poison gas. Other Jews continued to be employed in forced labor camps where many died from starvation, abuse, exhaustion, or being used to test as test subjects in deadly medical experiments. There are lots of uh, uses of historical archives regarding the Holocaust to understand contemporary medical racism and eugenics. And so next week, when I discuss the case of Cindy Gladue, who is a Cree woman who was murdered in Edmonton in Canada, I will discuss the ways that people compared the use of her body parts as medical evidence to Nazism. And I will also discuss the ways that Indigenous activists and feminists have used writings regarding medical racism and Nazism to discuss the forced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls in the Canadian healthcare system or by the Canadian healthcare system. So this historical information is obviously useful in making sense of genocide and eugenics. In 1941 or early 1942, the highest levels of the German government decided to murder all Jews in Europe. Victims were deported by rail to extermination camps, where if they survived the journey, most were killed with poison gas. Other Jewish people continued to be employed in forced labor camps where many died from starvation, abuse, exhaustion, or being used as test subjects in deadly medical experiments. Although many Jewish people tried to escape, surviving and hiding was difficult due to factors such as lack of money to pay helpers and the risk of denunciation. The property, homes, and jobs belonging to murdered Jews were redistributed to the German occupiers and other non-Jews. Although the majority of Holocaust victims died in 1942, the killing continued at a lower rate until the end of the World War, or until the end of war in May 1945. Many Jewish survivors emigrated outside of Europe after the war. A few Holocaust perpetrators faced criminal trials. Billions of dollars in repatriations have been paid, although falling short of the Jews' losses. The Holocaust has been commemorated in museums, memorials, and culture. It has become central to Western historical consciousness as a symbol of the ultimate human evil. So Edward Said was arguably one of the most impressive post-colonial scholars of our time, and he wrote a book called Orientalism. And Said was a Palestinian-American philosopher, academic, literary critique, and political activist, and he was a professor at Columbia University. Edward Said wrote a great deal about stateless people, and he did make reference to Nazism and colonialism throughout his work and discussed the persecution or the construction of a stateless people and then their persecution over generations. In Orientalism, Said was interested in how the construction of a group of people who were imagined to belong to not only a certain geographical region, but to a certain set of tropes or ideas who could be ascribed certain characteristics, such as being Eastern, was used to justify colonial rule. And in Orientalism, Said was interested also, or Said wrote about the gendered nature of Orientalism. So he wrote about the French writer Flaubert and Flaubert's courtesan Kuchek Hanem, who was an Egyptian woman. And Said wrote that she never represented herself, her feelings, her emotions, her story. Flaubert spoke for her and about her. And this was used as an example by Said to talk about the relative strength of the Occident to always represent and speak for the Orient. So, in the article about anti-Semitism, Sandra Gilman discusses the ways that Jewish people were always constructed by Nazis and later by predominantly Christian nation states, and how Jewish people's bodies and facial features were also constructed by others in order to justify genocide, eugenics, the theft of property, and war. So this is a clip of Naomi Klein discussing Palestine and protest and solidarity.
As many as 300 protesters were arrested in Brooklyn on Tuesday night, where thousands of mostly Jewish New Yorkers gathered for a Seder in the streets to stop arming Israel, they said. This on the second night of Passover. The demonstration was held at Grand Army Plaza, 1 block away from the home of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. It came just hours before the Senate overwhelmingly approved a $95 billion foreign aid package that includes some $14 billion in arms and security funding to Israel. A series of speakers addressed the rally, including journalist and author Naomi Klein, Palestinian activist Linda Sarsour, and several Jewish students suspended from Columbia University, where students have held a Gaza solidarity encampment. These are some of the voices of the demonstrators yesterday speaking at the Seder in the streets.
Tonight's Seder in the streets, which will be happening on the second night of Passover, which is a holiday we observe every year that is all about liberation and how our liberations are intertwined with one another, is coming just hours ahead of a likely Senate vote on $14 billion in military funding and weapons to Israel. So we're here to tell Senator Schumer that this is enough and we need to end U.S. complicity in Israel's genocide against Palestinians. And at the core of the Passover story is that we cannot be free until all people are free. And right now, what we're seeing is that the Israeli government and the United States government are carrying out a genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, over 34,000 people killed in 6 months, in the name of Jewish safety, in the false name of Jewish freedom. We could possibly celebrate a holiday for Jewish liberation. It's protesting the genocide because our nation is tied together with Palestinian liberation. Honestly, I'm more moved than I have been in months watching young Jews get arrested alongside Jewish elders, saying not in our name as we have for 6 months. And the Senate is still about to pass this massive funding package. Happy Passover, free Palestine. Now there are hundreds in the streets. People are taking arrests, saying business as usual will not go on. We are here at the doorstep of Senator Chuck Schumer. To the people in Palestine, we love you. We are with you. We are going to stop this U.S. funding so that you can fight for your own liberation.
Some of the voices at the Seder in the streets to stop arming Israel that was held at Grand Army Plaza on Tuesday and the second night of Passover. Among those who addressed the crowd during the Seder was award-winning author and activist Naomi Klein. This is some of what she had to say.
My friends, I've been thinking about Moses and his rage when he came down from the mount to find the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. The eco-feminist in me has always been uneasy about this story. What kind of God is jealous of animals? What kind of God wants to hoard all the sacredness of the earth for himself? But there is, of course, a less literal way of understanding this story. It is a lesson about false idols, about the human tendency to worship the profane and shiny, to look to the small and material rather than the large and transcendent. What I want to say to you this evening at this revolutionary and historic Seder in the streets is that too many of our people are worshiping a false idol once again. They are enraptured by it. They are drunk on it. They are profaned by it. And that false idol is called Zionism. It is a false idol that takes our most profound biblical stories of justice and emancipation from slavery, the story of Passover itself, and turns them into brutalist weapons of colonial land theft, roadmaps for ethnic cleansing and genocide. It is a false idol that has taken the transcendent idea of the promised land, a metaphor for human liberation that has traveled across faiths to every corner of this globe and dared to turn it into a deed of sale for a militarist ethno-state. Political Zionism's version of liberation is itself profane. From the start, it required the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and ancestral lands in the Nakba. From the start, it has been at war with collective dreams of liberation. At a Seder, it is worth remembering that this includes the dreams of liberation and self-determination of the Egyptian people. This false idol of Zionism has long equated Israeli safety with Egyptian dictatorship and unfreedom and client state. From the start, it has produced an ugly kind of freedom that saw Palestinian children not as human beings, but as demographic threats. Much as the Pharaoh in the book of Exodus feared the growing population of Israelites and thus ordered the death of their sons. And as we know, Moses was saved from that by being put in a basket and adopted by an Egyptian woman. Zionism has brought us to our present moment of cataclysm, and it is time that we say clearly, it has always been leading us here. It is a false idol that has led far too many of our own people down a deeply immoral path that now has them justifying the shredding of core commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. The commandments brought down from the mount. It is a false idol that equates Jewish freedom with cluster bombs that kill and maim Palestinian children. Zionism is a false idol that has betrayed every Jewish value, including the value that we place on questioning a practice embedded in the Seder itself with its 4 questions asked by the youngest child. It also betrays the love that we have as a people for text and for education. Today, this false idol dares to justify the bombing of every single university in Gaza, the destruction of countless schools, of archives, of printing presses, the killing of hundreds of academics, scholars, journalists, poets, essayists, This is what Palestinians call scholasticide, the killing of the infrastructure and the means of education. Meanwhile, in this city, the universities call the NYPD and barricade themselves against the grave threat posed by their own students, asking them, students embodying the spirit of the Seder, asking the most basic question, asking questions like, how can you claim to believe in anything at all, least of all us, while you enable, invest in, and collaborate with this genocide? The false idol of Zionism has been allowed to grow unchecked for far too long. So tonight we say, it ends here. Our Judaism cannot be contained by an ethno-state, for our Judaism is internationalist by its very nature. Our Judaism cannot be protected by the rampaging military of that ethno-state, for all that military does is sow sorrow and reap hatred, including hatred against us as Jews. Our Judaism is not threatened by people raising their voices in solidarity with Palestine across lines of race, ethnicity, physical ability, gender identity, and generations. Our Judaism is one of those voices and knows that in this chorus lies both our safety and our collective liberation. Our Judaism is the Judaism of the Passover Seder, the gathering in ceremony to share food and wine with loved ones and strangers alike. This ritual, light enough to carry on our backs, in need of nothing but one another, we don't need walls, we need no temple, no rabbi, and there is a role for everyone, including, especially, the smallest child. The Seder is portable, a diaspora technology, if ever there was one. It is made to hold our collective grieving, our contemplation, our questioning, our remembering, and our reviving and rekindling of the revolutionary spirit. So tonight, go look around. This here is our Judaism. As waters rise and forests burn and nothing is certain, we pray at the altar of solidarity and mutual aid, no matter the cost. We don't need or want the false idol of Zionism. We want freedom from the project that commits genocide in our name. We want freedom from the ideology that has no plan for peace, except for deals with murderous theocratic petrostates next door, while selling the technologies of robo-assassinations to the world. We seek to liberate Judaism from an ethno-state that wants Jews to be perennially afraid, that wants our children afraid, that wants us to believe that the world is against us so that we go running to its fortress, or at least keep sending the weapons and the donations. That is the false idol. And it's not just Netanyahu. It's the world he made and the world that made him. It's Zionism.
That's right.
What are we? We, in these streets for months and months, we are the Exodus from Zionism. So, to the Chuck Schumers of this world, we do not say, let our people go. We say, we have already gone, and your kids, they're with us now.
Award-winning journalist and author Naomi Klein speaking at what was called the Seder in the Streets to Stop Arming Israel on Tuesday at Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, a block from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's home. Special thanks to Hannah Elias, Eric Halverson, and Ishmael Darrow of Democracy Now!
There has been a lot of interesting scholarly writing, obviously, about these very broad historical, political questions, and also theoretical questions. The course is called Race and Racism. So, race is obviously in scare quotes because critical race theorists and post-colonial scholars have argued, and most cited academic scholarship in this time period has argued that race is a social construct. There is no biological basis for race. However, racism is real. And the interesting thing about the conflation between race and religion is that religious practice is perhaps real, sometimes on an everyday basis, sometimes uh, quite casually, but people who do ascribe to a certain set of religious doctrines obviously claim an identity that is material and that informs their lives and their thinking. However, the racialization of religion and the ethnicization of religion, which involves imagining that nation states can draw clear boundaries or borders and keep people very separately, and then imagine that there is some sense of racial or religious purity over generations, is, I would argue, quite false. I'm not religious. I do not believe in religion, or I don't practice any religion. And so my interest in thinking about religion is in thinking about the ways that religion is often used, in the same way that race is often used, to argue that there is a sense of purity or division, often within conflict zones, or often to justify the seizure of land or the claiming of land, and also to justify the banning of intermarriage between people, and to justify the hoarding of wealth over one class or caste, or yes, religion of people over generations. So I would argue that some of the most immoral things are often done in the name of religion, such as the practice of the caste system, or eugenic policy, the killing of people, the denial of inheritance, the hoarding of land. However, it's interesting just to think about what religion is and why it is seen to be exalted in some ways, something that is separate from the mass in this time period, in the same way that race and whiteness is seen to be, it's constructed as something that is kind of almost holy. So in his text, Freud and the Non-European, Edward Said used a great deal of archival materials to discuss Freud's essay, Moses and Monotheism. And Said cites this essay, Moses and Monotheism, to discuss politics in the Middle East today. He proposes that Freud's assumption that Moses was an Egyptian undermines any simple ascription of a pure identity, and further, that identity itself cannot be thought or worked through without the recognition of the limits inherent in it. Said suggests that such an unresolved, nuanced sense of identity might, if embodied in political reality, have formed, or might still form, the basis for a new understanding between Jews and Palestinians. Instead, Israel's relentless march towards an exclusively Jewish state denies any sense of a more complex, inclusive past. And the rise of religious nation states or countries that use religion to claim some sort of justification for the hoarding of wealth and land is common in our time period. And many have argued that India has seen a rise in Hindu nationalism that has justified the banning of interreligious marriage and the refusal to allow people to do business fairly and the seizure of property from non-Hindus. So this pattern of behavior is really perhaps an extreme form of class antagonism. The return to race and religion is reified ideas as ideas that do not require scarecoats such as race or religious purity, I think are also really interesting because this is also a time when abortion has been banned throughout many states in the United States of America. And while queer rights and transgender rights have become mainstream at the level of law, aggressive forms of heterosexuality that imagine some sort of racial and religious purity that involves no consensual sex and imagines no consensual sex as being holy is also a really terrifying reality of our time. The point that Edward Said makes in looking at Moses and monotheism is that the purity of people has always is obviously a fiction, and it masks the closeness of people, particularly in the Middle East and the global South. And I've done an extensive amount of research about rape and sexual violence in India, and also sex and queerness in India. And so um, sex in the global South and in the Middle East, or sex, I guess, throughout the world, but particularly for working class and poor people, is not something that has ever been really pure or could be contained or controlled. Birth and reproduction are things that happen all the time, and many people are not kind of quarantine from each other because of the realities that working class people and poor people throughout the world will, for better or worse, have to share space. So I'll discuss four themes. Firstly, anti-Semitism and eugenics. Second, racial hierarchy, race, and colonial theory. Thirdly, racism and disease. And fourthly, ethnic cleansing and war. So the first theme is anti-Semitism and eugenics. Anti-Semitism, also spelled anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism with a capital S, is hostility to, prejudice towards, or discrimination against Jews. This sentiment is a form of racism, and a person who harbors it is called an anti-Semite. Primarily, anti-Semitic tendencies may be motivated by negative sentiment towards Jews as a people, or by negative sentiment towards Jews with regard to Judaism. In the former case, usually presented as racial anti-Semitism, a person's hostility is driven by the belief that Jews constitute a distinct race with inherent traits or characteristics that are repulsive or inferior to the preferred traits or characteristics within that person's society. So Sandra Gilman's article is again similar to many of the works that we've read in the class, which is titled Race in scare quotes, and Racism, which is without any scare quotes. And the article constantly poses this question about whether or not reifying or upholding this idea of race or religious purity is a good thing. And Gilman makes comparisons between the persecution of Jewish people and anti-Black racism. That obviously the creation of Black communities and Black politics is a response to racism, but is this idea and this of kind of separatism and this fear of being something other than one's kind of given identity a good thing? Judith Butler has written extensively about the performativity of identity, and Butler would argue, as a gender studies scholar, that identity is not given. We are not something just because we are given a name at birth by our parents. One's relationship to, say, the caste system involves a set of performatives, and from a feminist perspective, often involves moving from the seamless passage of being a dutiful daughter of a rich man who normalizes things like domestic violence or neglect, to being the dutiful wife of a rich man who normalizes things like domestic violence and neglect. So if you are given a name at birth, that doesn't mean you have to perform under this sign, and it doesn't mean it's necessarily righteous or moral to do so. So Gilman then discusses these different types of anti-Semitism. A person's hostility is driven by their religion's perception of Jews and Judaism, typically accompanying doctrines of supersession that expect or demand Jews to turn away from Judaism and submit to the religion presenting itself as Judaism's successor faith. This is a common theme within other Abrahamic religions. The development of race and religious anti-Semitism has historically been encouraged by the concept of anti-Judaism, which is distinct from anti-Semitism itself. There are various ways in which anti-Semitism is manifested, ranging in the level of severity of Jewish persecution. On the more subtle end, it consists of expressions of hatred or discrimination against individual Jews and may or may not be accompanied by violence. On the most extreme end, it consists of programs of genocide, which may or may not be state-sponsored. So the essential question that Gilman asks, and a lot of the critical race theorists ask, including scholars that discuss anti-Black racism and the construction of a Black community in this time period, is it a good thing to then respond to persecution on the grounds of essentialism by constructing essentialist communities? So if we begin from the premise that race is actually a historical construct in the same way that all of the writings, all the anti-Semitic writings that justify the Holocaust and also were used to justify slavery and colonialism, construct this idea of the Jew or Jewish people as being pure, or as all having a set of characteristics. So the writings at the end of the essay about the nose are really kind of fantastical, that Nazis imagined that because of certain facial features, one was ascribed with a sort of shrewdness, a kind of cunning that allowed for certain business deals and allowed one to obtain a certain position in the class structure. And I would argue that facial features and appearance really do not determine one's position in the class structure. Although one can inherit wealth over generations, what one does with that inheritance is often a matter of choice, but also involves other middle class and wealthy actors or other working class social actors who will support a certain structure of class, or will try to have ambitions to change the class structure, or will enact certain behaviors that lead to class degeneracy. So, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are now connected to responses to war, and so, or are kind of, I guess, are become unfortunate responses to ethnic cleansing and war.
A rabbi's house egged and tagged with swastikas in BC. A Jewish-owned business surrounded by protesters in Toronto. Canada's Jewish community says increasingly it's feeling under attack.
It is obvious that anti-Semitism is still alive and well.
Canada's Palestinian community is feeling uneasy as well. The murder of a Palestinian American boy in Illinois this month, fresh on everyone's mind. The 6-year-old was killed in what police say was a vicious anti-Muslim attack. In Toronto, Palestinian parents say their children are also being targeted.
Since October 10th, our group has been informed of numerous cases of anti-Palestinian racism, discrimination, harassment, and bullying in schools across Toronto.
There is a lot of disinformation that is out there.
Sociologist Jasmine Zine worries that in the wake of the Hamas attack on Israel, Islamophobia is now being stoked in Canada as it was following September 11th.
That constructed, Muslims very broadly as being connected to terrorism and violence.
As an example, Zine points to the rallies in support of the Palestinian people, protests that have been viewed across communities in very different ways.
In Alberta and across the country, of course, it's the vulgar protests in support of Hamas. Of course, it's anti-Semitic because they just couch their words. Free Palestine. Free Palestine from what?
We make it clear at all of our demonstrations that we stand against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. I want to stress that anyone who supports Palestine needs to understand that anti-Semitism is not what this is about.
Communities seemingly at odds within Canada, sharing a sense of fear and profound pain. Heather Urix West, Global News, Calgary.
So, Sandra Gilman begins the article by discussing the ways that eugenics or racial discrimination, ideas of race inform everyday processes like the formation of romantic relationships and friendships. And Gilman writes, the personal columns in the Washingtonian, the local city magazine in Washington, D.C., are filled with announcements of individuals in search of mates. In search of is the rubric under which these advertisements are grouped. These advertisements are peppered with various codes so well known that they are never really explained. Divorced white male, just recently arrived from Boston, seeks a non-smoking, financially secure 40+ who loves to laugh, or single Jewish female, Kathleen Turner type, with a zest for life in search of S/DJM for a passionate relationship. Recently, I was struck by a notice which began, divorced white Jewish female, young, 41, PhD, professional, no kids, seeks all these things, exceptional mind, heart, and soul. SDWWM. What fascinates me, writes Gilman, were the brackets, advertisements for Jews or for African Americans or for whites made it clear that individuals were interested in choosing their sexual partners from certain designated groups within American society. But the brackets implied that here was a woman who was both white and Jewish. Given the racial politics of post-civil rights America, where do Jews fit in? It made me ask the question, which the woman who placed the personal advertisement was clearly clearly was addressing, are Jews white? And what does white mean in this context? So this question as to whether Jews are white is not simply about skin color or race. It is also about the politics of Israel and Palestine, Palestine and Israel. It's also about the politics of protest and arrest in this time period. So this idea of whiteness is connected to what Michel Foucault referred to as biopolitics. So in his lectures at the Collège de Francais, Michel Foucault discusses biopolitics, and biopolitics refers to a way of governance that involves intervening into the human body. So biopolitics is a system of governance in which we intervene into life. Biopower refers to the techniques that we use to intervene into life. So warnings on cigarette packages or alcohol, free contraception at university health centers. And these are the techniques of biopower that we use to enact biopolitics, to ensure that a certain population will be born. And unfortunately, as Achille Mbembe discusses when writing about necropolitics, that a certain population will not be born. So anti-Semitism and racism are central to modern biopolitics everywhere. This can be obviously taken to extremes in acts of ethnic cleansing, but in the most minute ways, nation building now involves this attention to race.
Moteur réserve, planifiez vos trajets jusqu'à 90 jours à l'avance.
Mon envie en fait en zèle était de participer à mon échelle à la pérennisation des savoir-faire ancestraux.
So Gilman discusses the body and the relationship between the human body and society. So when discussing large, broad, or kind of large global conflicts or large issues like Palestine and Israel or ethnic cleansing, one often moves away from discussing the really minute details. And the feminist movement has really been clear that the personal is, of course, political, and the most kind of broad international relations issues are often discussed without any personalization. And Senator Gilman is really clear that the human body is an image of society. And Gilman writes that the human body is always treated as an image of society, and there can be no natural way of considering the body that does not involve at the same time a social dimension. Interest in its apertures depend on the preoccupation with social exits and entrances, escape routes and invasions. If there is no concern to preserve social boundaries, I would not expect to find concern with bodily boundaries. So this preservation of social boundaries or national boundaries is really about bodily boundaries. And from a Marxist perspective, obviously, this preservation of bodily boundaries is about the class structure and the boundaries between the working class and the middle class, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So eugenics is central to the ways that the body becomes not only a metaphor for society, but the body becomes used as a tool to preserve a certain social order, class structure, and a certain nation state that is controlled by an ethnic and religious majority. So eugenics is the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. Developed largely by Sir Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race, eugenics was increasingly discredited as unscientific and racially biased during the 20th century, especially after the adoption of its doctrines by the Nazis in order to justify their treatment of Jews, disabled people, and other minority groups. So this eugenic thinking has always been central to nation building and is central to nation building in Turtle Island or Canada. And next week I'll discuss Indigenous rights and Indigenous feminism. So legacies of genocide and eugenics were taken up and passed along through residential schooling. And this author states that I have focused on the tethering together of those who are exalted with those who are thus denigrated, on how individualization obscures systemic and normative violence, on how critique can collude with status quo, on contextualizing life skills training and the professional psychologies as both ethnocentric and internally eccentric within what I've called my culture, and on taking behavior modification assumptions about repetitious learning to their logical conclusion in consideration of what it means to practice living in an institution, to have others intervene and take control when one is becoming angry. And I'll make sure when I post the slides online that I put the references online, but I will come back to these quotes next week when we discuss Indigenous issues. The point is that nation building always involves intervening into the body and intervening into someone's body, mind, and life for the purposes of building a certain country or the purposes of reproducing a certain class structure. So the second point I'll discuss is racial hierarchy, race, and colonial theory. Sandra Gilman discusses Theodosius Dobzhansky's articles from 1967 about anti-Semitism and the construction of race. Every person has no type, writes Dobzhansky. Every person has no type and a life history different from any other person, be that person a member of his family, clan, race, or mankind. Beyond the universal rights of all human beings, which may be a typological notion, a person ought to be evaluated by his own merits. Dobzhansky and many scientists of the 1960s dismissed race as a category of scientific evaluation, arguing that whenever it had been included over the course of history, horrible abuses had resulted. At the same time, within Western, specifically American culture of the 1960s, there was also a transvaluation of the concept of race. Black was beautiful and roots were to be celebrated, not denied. So race then leads to the construction of positive racial identities or communities that try to further the self-esteem and economic ambitions of groups of people who have been racialized. However, the problem is that if these communities reify race or exalt race to the idea of existence, something that is actually in existence, then the construction of race can never really be undone. Racism is a direct result of a belief in purity or a belief in race. The reason that race exists is because of racism. The reason that racism exists is because of race. So if we were to think about similar comparisons that Judith Butler offers us when thinking about performativity, sexism often exists because we believe in the gender binary. The gender binary then upholds sexism. So the feminist movement does exist. However, in the last 10 years, many feminists have argued against TERPs, exclusionary radical feminists and argued that we should have a feminist movement that includes transgender people, queer people, and all people who support some sort of justice beyond this binary construction of gender. So I would argue that race is similar. So Sandra Gilman then discusses the ways that race has often been central to neo-colonial policies. The view was that seeing oneself as being part of a race was a strengthening factor. We, at the close of the 20th century, have, however, not suddenly become callous to the negative potential of the concept of race. Given its abuse in the Shoah, as well as in neocolonial policies throughout the world, it is clear that a great deal of sensitivity must be used in employing the very idea of race. In reversing the idea of race, we have not eliminated its negative implications. We have only masked them. So similarly, if we were to think about the feminist movement and Judith Butler's writings regarding performativity and critiques of transphobic feminists, simply ascribing women as a group of people with positive characteristics does not eliminate gender essentialism. And it is not really true that someone who is born as a cisgender woman is necessarily good or maternal. I'm a cisgender woman, or I was called a cisgender woman at birth, and I identify, I guess, as a woman, but this does not mean that I deserve to be thought of in any way that is outside of my action or inaction or ethical or unethical behavior. It is also clear that the meanings associated with race impacts on those included within these constructed categories. So similarly, I guess I obviously have been a victim of sexism or discriminated against before, but this, again, does not mean that I will respond in a certain way to this behavior. I could actually respond by internalizing sexism and abusing other people who I think are women or should be women. So the meanings associated with race impacts on those included within these constructed categories. It forms them and shapes them. And this can be a seemingly positive or a clearly negative response. There is no question that there are real, i.e., shared genetic distinctions within and between groups. But the rhetoric of what this shared distinction comes to mean for the general culture and for the group so defined becomes central to any understanding of the implications of race. In reversing the idea of race, we have not eliminated its negative implications. We have only masked them, for it is also clear that the meanings associated with race impacts on those included within these constructed categories. It forms them and shapes them. This can be a seemingly positive or a clearly negative response. There is no question that there are real, i.e., shared genetics distinctions within and between groups, but the rhetoric of what this shared distinction comes to mean for the general culture and for the group so defined becomes central to any understanding of the implications of race. So the third point is racism and disease. And Gilman's article is interesting in this time period if we think about the relationship between anti-Semitism, medical Nazism, and medical racism. Health Canada is now facing a class action lawsuit filed by Indigenous women who are accusing nurses of forcibly sterilizing sterilizing Indigenous women, using the Canadian healthcare system. So medical racism, I think, is one of the most brutal forms of racism. It really does involve destroying someone's life and destroying someone's capacity for happiness and for a life without pain. Language is really interesting because sometimes people don't really understand what is even being said about them, or they can not pay attention. They can be really busy and not look at the internet, or just not really even understand what someone is trying to say about them. Sometimes because of changes over generations or geographical context, language changes. Je parle français parce que la deuxième langue du Canada est français. Français est une langue très différente. French is a very different language than English. So the kinds of uses of language change depending upon one's location. So Sandra Gilman discusses medical racism. All races, according to the ethnology of the day, were described in terms of aesthetics as either ugly or beautiful. African blacks, especially the Hottentot, as I have shown elsewhere, became the epitome of the ugly race. And being ugly, as I have also argued, was not merely a matter of aesthetics, but was a clear sign of pathology, of disease. Being black was not beautiful. Indeed, the blackness of the African, like the blackness of the Jew, was believed to mark a pathological change in the skin, the result of congenital syphilis. And as we see, syphilis was given the responsibility for the form of the nose. This kind of medical racism is really terrifying. And Sandra Gilman has written an essay about the Hottentot Venus, Sargi Bartman. And if you travel to Paris, to Journée à Paris, you can visit the Eiffel Tower, and Georges Cuvier's name is one of many men's names on the Eiffel Tower. And Paris has one of the lowest percentages of street names named after women, which is something that feminists in Paris have protested against. And staged various protests, and also put names of women who have done notable things in France on the streets of Paris. But you will see Georges Cuvier's name on the Eiffel Tower, and Cuvier was a scientist, a colonial scientist, who kidnapped a woman named Sargi Bartman from South Africa, and she was part of the Khoikhoi tribe. And Sargi Bartman was made to labor in every possible way for white French people. She was made to dance as a kind of captive entertainer. She was put in a cage and put on display naked. Her genitals were on display for all to see. She was obviously sexually abused and raped. She was made to work as a forced laborer. And when she finally died at a very young age, Georges Cuvier cut out her genitalia and put it in a jar, and also her brain, and put it in a jar, and did experiments on her. So this medical racism shares similarities with the Nazis, who often used Jewish people's bodies, and specifically Jewish women's bodies, for medical experiments. So Sandra Gilman writes of the ways that science was often a real fiction used to justify the theft of Jewish people's property and used to justify genocide. Similarly, Gilman, in his writings about Sargi Bartman, argues that colonial science was used to justify the enslavement of Africans and the persecution of Black peoples like Saartjie Baartman, who is sometimes referred to as Sarah Baartman as well in archives. Jews look different. They have a different appearance, and this appearance has pathogenomic significance. Skin color marked the Jew as both different and diseased. For the Jewish scientists such as Sigmund Freud, these minor differences in people who are otherwise alike form the basis of feelings of strangeness and hostility between them. These kind of minor differences for Freud also justify narcissism, and when taken to extreme, the narcissism is a pathological form of narcissism that can justify crime. So it is the smallness of the differences that often makes anti-Semitism so brutal and severe and unrelenting among all classes of people. If one's difference was so radically different, then this would perhaps secure the class structure. If someone is, say, not a native English language speaker, or they're really, say, a person who has not inherited a great deal of wealth or could not claim inheritance over generation, then they would perhaps be working class. And a lot of other people of color in the Americas often end up being working class, and there often isn't this seamless passage from being someone from a very poor country to being a middle class person or a bourgeois person in a first world country. But what Freud argues is that this kind of minor difference between Jewish people and white Christians, who often have more wealth historically, is what really troubles people, because these minor differences could be masked or overlooked. And this might mean that the class structure could change in or throughout the world. So Sandra Gilman discusses the ways that anti-Semitism was written on the skin as a disease. And this is obviously the most brutal form of biopolitics. When taken to extremes, biopolitics then necessitates necropolitics in order to build a pure ethnic nation state, in order to build a future of white Christians or a future of white Jewish people or a future of upper caste Hindus, a future of kind of a pure country of Sunni Muslims. One must cleanse the population of minorities, or one must make minorities so poor and so alienated that they cannot reproduce or they cannot ever fully settle. So the Jew's disease is written on the skin. It is the appearance, the skin color, the external manifestation of the Jew, which marks the Jew as different. There is no question for a non-Jewish visitor to Vienna, upon first seeing the Jew, that the Jew suffers from Jewishness. The internal moral state of the Jew's very psychology is reflected in the diseased exterior of the Jew. As mentioned earlier, plica polanica is a real dermatologic syndrome. It results from living in filth and poverty, but it was also associated with the unhygienic nature of the Jew, and by the mid-19th century with the Jew's special relationship to the most frightening disease of the period, syphilis. For the non-Jew, seeing the Jew, it mirrored popular assumptions about the Jew's inherent essential nature. Pezel's contemporary, Joseph Roher, stressed the disgusting skin diseases of the Jew. By the mid-century, being Black, being Jewish, being diseased, and being ugly come to be inexorably linked. All right. come to be indisputably linked. Use another synonym. So this medical racism and race as a disease is something that is central to the Holocaust. And if you look at the Holocaust Encyclopedia, the construction of groups of people as diseased was a justification for mass extermination of Jewish people. And the use of the medical system and the use of medicine is one of the most terrifying examples of racism and the sterilization of Indigenous women and girls in Canada is really disturbing. I hope that this is still recording. It says that it's recording. Okay, I hope it's still recording. So the nose is central to Gilman's article about anti-Semitism, and Senator Gilman discusses the ways that the Jew's nose could not be reformed. Interrelated with the meaning of skin was the meaning of the Jew's physiognomy, especially the Jew's nose, and it was also associated with the Jew's nature. So this reading of someone's behavioral characteristics, their shrewdness, their mind, and their actions through things like facial features are something that Gilman discusses in relation to anti-Black racism as well, and the ways that imagining that one will behave in certain ways because of their facial features justifies discrimination. In the most extreme, it can justify police violence. So I'll finish then by discussing ethnic cleansing and war. By the close of the 19th century, the reality of the physical difference of the Jew as a central marker of race had come more and more into question. Antithetical theories such as those of Frederick Ratzel began to argue that skin color was a reflex of geography and could and did shift when a people moved from one part of the globe to another. So the use of skin color to imagine that one belongs to a different country is obviously a form of xenophobia and justifies the persecution of stateless people, so that one can never settle in a predominantly white Christian country because their color or skin color or our color or our names mean that we belong elsewhere. And I would argue that this kind of xenophobia justifies labor exploitation, it justifies poor housing policies, and it justifies alienation. So anti-Semitism is alive, and unfortunately, it exists, I mean, everywhere, and it exists in Paris. Dans Paris, beaucoup d'anti-Semitism. Paris is also interesting because there has been a lot of press also about phobia and the banning of specifically Muslim women's religious signifiers in public. And French anti-Semitism perhaps corresponds with French secularism, and in major cities like Paris, perhaps I would argue from a Marxist perspective that Paris is a very capitalist city. It is a very class stratified city, and so the kind of push towards secularism and the removal of religious signifiers in public corresponds with a really consumer-driven society.
États-Unis, voyager moderne. French Bee a choisi la 350.
It's interesting if you go to La Marais, like if I mean, gentrification is also an issue that some of the students I've had in the past have discussed in relation to race and religion. That the gentrification of Le Marais, the Marais has led to the construction of a neighborhood that is really a consumer-driven neighborhood with there's lots of vintage clothing. There are lots of cocktail bars. The queer community in the Marais is quite active. So the fact that it was a historically Jewish area often, I think, meant that rent was lower, and it meant that many people moved into this area who could afford to live there, like artists and writers, but people who could afford to open small businesses like kind of bars and specifically small boutiques. So I think it's interesting to consider the relationship between race, religion, consumer culture, and gentrification. There are other neighborhoods, and you could make similar comparisons between Harlem and Brooklyn that were historically Black neighborhoods, and also Black Christian neighborhoods, often Black Christian neighborhoods, where now you will find a lot of. For the Jewish scientists such as Sigmund Freud, these minor differences in people who are otherwise alike form the basis of feelings of strangeness and hostility between them. This is what Freud clinically labeled as the narcissism of minor differences. But are these differences minor, either from the perspective of those labeling or those labeled? And reducing the sense of the basis of difference between people who are otherwise alike, and reducing the sense of the basis of difference between people who are otherwise alike. Freud was not drawing on the Enlightenment claim of the universality of human rights, but also on the Christian underpinning of these claims. For this, narcissism fights successfully against feelings of fellowship and overpowers the commandment that all men should love one another. It is the Christian claim to universal brotherly love that Freud was employing in arguing that the differences between himself, his body, and the body of the Aryan are retrieval. Freud comprehended the special place that the Jew played in the demonic universe of the Aryan psyche, but he marginalized this role as to the question of the Jew's function as an agent of economic discharge in the world of the Aryan ideal, rather than as one the central aspects in the science of his time. So this kind of narcissism of minor differences for Freud forms the basis of the building of a pure Christian nation state that can justify the killing of Jewish people. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop the recorded lecture there. When we meet in the synchronous class, I will play this clip as well of David, who has this blog.
Trois raisons de rencontrer les missionnaires de l'Église de Jésus-Christ des Saints des derniers jours. Anti-Semitism is ill-equipped to
Felix Guattari's.
Le Monsieur Cuisine Connect de Silvercrest est à 175 € dès lundi en exclusivité chez Lidl. Lidl, le vrai prix des bonnes choses.
Combien vaut votre voiture? Sur vendezvotrevoiture.fr, vous pouvez trouver facilement et rapidement en ligne.
Hey everyone, back again. Today we're going to talk about Felix Guattari's Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist. Now before jumping into it, if you want to follow me anywhere other than on here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy, on Twitter, which is just my name, at David Guignol. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you'll be able to find the video for this episode on YouTube if you're into that, where I also release other videos if you're into that at all. If you're listening to this, if you found this on YouTube, you'll be able to find it in podcast form where there shouldn't be any ads, which is obviously better. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way to make them accessible to help you along your philosophical journey. So if you're new, subscribe, leave a comment, like, share, tell your friends. That would help me out a lot. If you want to help me out monetarily, you can do that via Patreon or PayPal, but obviously no pressure. If you're listening to this in podcast form on probably just Apple Podcasts, you could leave a review, would help me out, and 5 stars would obviously be great. And yeah, I don't waste any more of your time with that. Let's talk about Guattari's text here. Everybody wants to be a fascist. So he's discussing fascism because it's a real problem. It's not some nebulous, speculative thing that doesn't have any effect in the real world. He was writing at a time, I think this was in the early 70s or so, but anyway, in that kind of historical period, coming out of World War II, when we saw the fascisms, Stalinist fascism, German fascism, Italian fascism, American fascism, we saw all these fascisms ostensibly go away, right? But to Guattari, their spirit is still very much alive. And so this text is a way for him to describe how they're continuing and how they are, the logic of fascism is found in each of us, and how we are very much, while predisposed might be kind of an extreme way to put it, we have a kind of propensity to fall for the trick of fascism. And so we have to be very careful. We have to be very much prepared to not do that. So in order for an analysis of fascism to proceed, it must acknowledge its reality, as I've kind of already said. So what that means is engaging with it both in a kind of abstract way, that is a macroscopic way, looking at it broadly, and looking at it more specifically in its microscopic kind of manifestations, or looking at it microscopically.
So stop it there, and we'll discuss these ideas from Felix Guattari's Everybody Wants to be a Fascist more in the synchronous class. I'll finish with this quote from Eli Wiesel. I swore never to be silent. I swore never to be silent. Whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation, we must always take sides. So the taking of sides, however, I don't think can be a matter of seeing names and facial features and deciding to then take sides. Obviously, human suffering is not something that is experienced by only one group of people. So that is the class for this week, and I look forward to your presentation assignments. Thank you.